Ohmio, we are an autonomous shuttle manufacturer. But to understand Ohmio, we need to understand sort of where Ohmio came from previously. And Ohmio actually spun out of a company called HMI Technologies. Some of you may have heard of us, but some of you may have not. But you've definitely seen our product, or at least driven by them. HMI Technologies is an electronic sign manufacturer, mostly for ITS, intelligent transport systems. So road signs, electronic road signs, sensors, and that sort of equipment. Basically things that improve transportation without building more roads. That's sort of our aim. And in sort of 2015, we had this bit of an introspective moment where we thought, all right, 10, 15, 20 years from now, are we still going to be selling the same products? We sell sort of light up signs, sort of lights on a board to communicate between the traffic operator and the driver of a vehicle. But once that driver of the vehicle is no longer a human and it's a computer, we've got autonomous vehicles coming in, are we still going to be communicating with them in the same way? Our inclination was no, and we're a company with a large amount of engineers there, and we wanted to understand this sort of by getting our hands dirty and playing around with the technology, sort of being part of the change rather than sort of aging out of the industry into sort of irrelevance as the technology moves past us. So we reached out to an autonomous shuttle manufacturer, one of the few back in those days, and we set up a consortium over with Christchurch Airport, Christchurch City Council, NZTA, MOT, University of Canterbury. We ran the first autonomous shuttle trial down in Christchurch with Christchurch Airport. Australia also looked over at what we were doing, and they wanted us to run a trial over in Melbourne at La Trobe University. That trial's now over. You can download the report and give it a read if you're interested in understanding a bit more about autonomous shuttle acceptability. And then we've got the trial in Sydney at Sydney Olympic Park. And so this was a mixture of different stakeholders in the equation. Basically, this is a new technology. And I mean, from us, we wanted to understand how it works, but then legislation, regulatory, sort of business reasons for other people, they are all part of it. So there's a lot of stakeholders involved when we roll out an autonomous shuttle. So for us, just concentrating on what we were doing, we had the shuttle, it was working fine, but we wanted to expand its functionality, and we were very keen on getting our hands dirty. So the vehicle didn't have a function where it would stop for a red traffic light, and we thought that would be a really good sort of first simple step of what we were doing. So we approached the company and we said, look, vehicle's great, it works. Could you tell us what signal we need to send to it, or tell us how to interface with the vehicle itself internally so that we can get the vehicle to pause trajectory when it gets to a red traffic light? And their answer to us surprised us. Basically, they said no, that they're the only ones that develop things for their vehicle, which took us by surprise. They were sort of thinking of the autonomy or transport equations as this. You supply the vehicle, and then the vehicle gives you transport. That's it. That's the end of it. It's a product you buy, and suddenly you have this capability. But we sort of thought of it in this way. It's more of an ecosystem for us, where the vehicle plays a large part of it, but you've also got infrastructure, which is the sort of charging stations, traffic light optimization, and basically everything that the vehicle needs to interact with as part of its journey. And then on top of that as well, you've got management systems. If you've got a fleet of autonomous shuttles, you'd need to be able to anticipate demand, change them out based on which ones have the right amount of charge, so that your service levels don't end up dropping. It's a big ecosystem sort of approach that needs to be taken. We tried to find a company that would work with us in this way, and we couldn't. So we thought either we wait for one of these companies to realize this back in 2016, 2017, or we just become that company. So that's where we started in May of 2017. So we started in January of that year. By May, we had a prototype that was working. This was a golf cart that we hacked. So we took and I'm very aware of who my audience is today, but we said, let's shelve the mechanical engineering challenges for now. People have built vehicles before, but very few have made them drive by themselves. So that's where we focused. We come from a microcontrollers and software background, so that's sort of where we gravitated towards. The mechanical challenges are definitely there and they're important, but our point of difference wasn't that we were building a vehicle, but we were making one drive by itself. We did that in 5 months, which was pretty cool. In September 2017 was the first demonstration of an autonomous vehicle on New Zealand roads. This was down in Christchurch with our 3 concept vehicles, also golf carts. We changed the way that the seats face, but the golf carts with shells on top, and they went outside the Christchurch Art Gallery, which was a pretty cool day. But that's to go in 9 months from not having written a line of code to demonstrating this on roads is a rapid scale of progress, which is something we're really proud of. In March of 2019, you may have seen this vehicle. This is Spark's 5G driverless car. It was part of their advertising campaign. Also our vehicle, based on the same platform, the golf cart, as the other Ohmio hops. This was, some people call this sort of, the news called this Darth Vader's car. It sort of had this angry look to it. And this was sort of one of the learnings that I got from this, is that it's not just about building a vehicle, but like people are interacting with this technology and they might see a face where you wouldn't have thought there would be a face. But I see the angry face too here, and that will definitely impact public acceptance and sort of the user trust. So looking at the human factors is something that sort of blipped onto our radar sort of back in 2019, and it's something that we're conscious of as time goes on. But really important step. It's not just about the technology, it's about serving people and seeing how people interact with it. In June of 2019, we managed to deliver a car to Christchurch Airport that was capable of doing the thing that we weren't able to do with the previous car. This is also the world's largest 3D printed vehicle. We ran into some production issues with the fabrication and the tooling of the molds. So we just said, let's just 3D print it, and we did. And that was the result of it. It was innovation that came about from restriction, and it was a great way to see and prototype our vehicle initially. And it was a 21 square meter printer, 7 by 3 meters, really large. We printed the vehicle in 13 pieces and assembled them together, sort of like a jigsaw. But if you ever see this vehicle down in Christchurch, you can actually look at the ridges. So the wheel arches, we didn't smooth them out. We sort of left the 3D printed lines in there, and it sort of has a nice story. And Christchurch Airport did a great job of incorporating that 3D printing story into the vehicle as well. June of 2020, we delivered our first vehicle this was probably our second vehicle actually, to Korea. So New Zealand is exporting autonomous vehicles to Korea, which is sort of the opposite way that that technology exchange happens. It would be sort of like us buying cheese from Korea, is the way I look at it. And you may have noticed that this is in June 2020. So this was in the midst of our lockdown. We couldn't go over to Korea to commission our own vehicles. So this is something that we had to do remotely. And we did that with some government partners over there that we had. And it ended up being quite good. In October of 2020, we demonstrated our vehicle at Pairata Rise. This is a housing development being built in, depending on what your definition is, South Auckland or south of Auckland, in between Drury and Pukekohe. And this is a community that's being built now that has roads that are narrower than what a bus is able to service. So if we're wanting to avoid things like park and rides, etc., there, looking at autonomous shuttles as sort of a first last mile solution makes a little bit of sense, so that people can ditch the car for that first mile of their journey as they go down to the train station or something like that. The way I say it is, if basically as soon as someone turns the key in their ignition or gets in their private car, you've lost the majority of the battles of making them switch transportation. What we're trying to do here is enable people to have on-demand, door-to-door public access to public transport, which is seen as one of the biggest barriers to the adoption of public transportation. It's not convenient enough, and it doesn't come around frequently enough. But if a vehicle could show up and pick you up from in front of your house and take you to a train station, more people would be more likely to go on there. At least that's what the research shows. In June of 2021, our Korean vehicle passed its testing, and you'll see a number plate on there. This is the vehicle in Korea is now legal. We've got 3 vehicles there, and they're able to operate on the roads completely legally, going up to 25 km per hour is their limit at the moment. We're the only company to have passed the new testing regime they have. They had a list of 100 deliverables, whereas before it used to be about 40. So our competitors need to catch up a little bit, which might be a little bit difficult for some of them, but that's something we're real proud of. This is one of the tests that they did with the vehicle going down a road, sort of a bit of a highway, and another vehicle popping out in front of it. Now the vehicle needs to anticipate this, our shuttle needs to anticipate that and drive a little bit slower and change its trajectory so that it doesn't end up colliding, and it needs to do that quite smoothly. Pass the test, but they did a bunch of tests like this, sort of making the vehicle stop from maximum speed as it approached a pile of I think it's soft foam with a tarpaulin, I think they put on top of it, so that if there was an accident, it wouldn't end up causing damage, but it never got to that stage. And just last month, we were granted some funding from the Australian government to look at and explore how 5G and autonomous shuttles can help serve the elderly population and people with limited access to mobility. So this is the Australian government now recognizing and seeing that autonomous shuttles and fast and low latency communication is important to the future of transport. So we're really honored that we're part of this scheme. That was, I think, $1.5 million Australian was the total amount for that one. So that's pretty much it. That gets us to where we are today. John, did you want me to go through a sort of a case study as how our vehicle is able to localize itself and sort of figuring out where it is from an AI and algorithm point of view? Would that be interesting? I can't. You're muted at the moment. Yeah, great. Okay, fantastic. We've got some. If there's some questions as well along the way, I'm happy to. Okay, we'll answer those questions a little bit later, I guess. So localization. So localization is the ability for a vehicle to, or not just a vehicle. We're talking about sort of robots and basically any sort of system to figure out where it is in space. And this is one of the 2 most important things, or I guess the lowest common denominators of autonomous shuttles. They need to know where they are and not hit anything on the way. So localization answers that first problem. So this sort of illustrates with these are our older vehicles, but the problem still works in the same way. They've got this GPS sort of antenna right here on the top, and that's that little white dot. This is the top view, and this is the side view of these vehicles. And that's our GPS there. Now, we had our vehicle when we get a GPS location, and I'm sure you've seen this if you go outside and you turn off your Wi-Fi, you'll see that you sort of drift around a little bit. And that's because GPS signals coming in aren't always 100% precise. They're not very precise. They'll give you a sort of a radius or confident. There's a bit of error that comes in from them, and that varies depending on atmospheric conditions, how far away you are from the different satellites, how many satellites are there, and line of sight to them, etc. But we can sort of, if we get sort of a splattering of these results, we can sort of get an average or figure out relatively where we're at. Yeah, and that's shown by this green circle. Now, with our vehicle, it was going along here. It was going along the footpath fine, but then it suddenly started to go a little bit haywire in this one location. And if we look closely at what that location is it's a tree. There's a tree in the way. And that tree, when the vehicle passes underneath it, is going to disrupt the GPS signal. So you go from a precision of, say, 1 meter or so to something like, I mean, over here we were talking about centimeters actually, to something multiple meters. Definitely not enough to be able to drive on the footpath well enough. So there's a couple options you could take to address this. And the reason for that is when we're under the tree, the accuracy, or the accuracy is still the same. It's the precision that sort of balloons out a little bit, and it becomes much harder to pinpoint where you are. And once your sort of precision becomes less than, I guess, like half the width of a lane, then it becomes really difficult for you to drive. Driving becomes more or less impossible. So what can we do? What are the two things? Well, there's two things that we found we could do. There was an engineering solution and an AI solution. Engineering solution was basically just chop down the tree. Let's get rid of it. And the AI team said, let's take in some sensor fusion. We thought about the two of them, and then we thought, no, you know what? The engineers are right. Let's just get the tree. Let's cut it down. Let's completely get rid of it. And that's how we solved the localization of I'm joking. It's the tree was cut down much later, but I couldn't resist sort of taking those photos and putting them in the presentation. No, we ended up using sensor fusion. That's what we went with. So sensor fusion sounds really, really cool. It's such a cool sounding concept, but what exactly is it? So if we're looking at just GPS to tell us where we are, then the GPS is our vehicle location. However, what sensor fusion does is it allows us to combine the information or the input from multiple sensors into a single understanding. So the first signal or the first input into our sensor fusion module might be the GPS, but then we've got other sensors, say a LiDAR or ODometry or whatever else. They all get combined, and then we take that out into one understanding, which is the vehicle location. So ODometry would be, I'm talking to mechanical engineers and I'm explaining ODometry. I don't feel like I need to very much, but basically based on the speed of the vehicle that you're going and sort of the steering and the errors associated with those, you can sort of plot out an area where you reasonably believe the vehicle to be in the next time step or delta, whatever you might think that would be. Next, we look at LiDAR, which is another way that you can localize. LiDAR, for those that don't know, works very similarly to radar. So if you think of those old sort of like a submarine, sort of with its looking up at those blips that come across under the ocean, take that concept but apply it to those rangefinders you get from Bunnings that tell you using a laser can tell you the distance between two locations, and stack like 16 of those above each other and spin them around really quickly, and you get this 3D point cloud of the world around you. And through that, you're able to see how far away objects are from you. How we use that for localization is the vehicle can sort of cast out these rays from itself and identify features. And based on a map that it knows about the world, say it's a very limited world with just 4 trees in it, we can start making guesses as to where the vehicle thinks it might be. So it could be in that tree, hopefully it isn't, but the tree's not a very good guess because those features don't really line up with anything. We can look here, it's a little bit better. 3 of the features line up, but a lot of other ones don't. So it's highly unlikely that it's over here, but it could still be likely. Or you look at a location like here, which is a much better candidate location. And so with LiDAR, we can use a particle filter here, which is one form of sensor fusion, to get a guess as to where the vehicle might be based on what it sees around it. And this is when someone says LiDAR or HD Map, so this is what they're talking about, how they localize within a pre-mapped area. It all together, if we take sort of what the GPS location is, what the odometry tells us is going to go where it's going to be next, and say what where the LiDAR thinks we are, even if the GPS sort of blows out and we go under a tree again, we can still relatively okay figure out where we are. And the reason we need something like sensor fusion is because there's no such thing as a perfect input type. There's no perfect sensor. each one of them has a drawback or a condition under which it fails. So GPS gives you an absolute position, but it fails if the skies are occluded, and its update time is once per second, which isn't very fast if you're starting to go a little bit faster. With odometry, it's good at getting very, very fast updates, but it's relative. So it can tell you based on where you are, where you'll be next, but it can't absolutely locate where you've been. And over time, the odometry information will have a compounding error. So it drifts, and I'll show a practical example of that. Finally, LiDAR gives you absolute, but if things move around in your area, then it starts to not recognize the areas as well. So it's very dependent on having up-to-date maps. And we developed, and this is the Swiss cheese model, which you may have heard before. It's about, rather than finding one perfect system, we have multiple systems with different different modalities based on different physical phenomena or ways of doing things, so that when one of them fails, not if, because everything fails at some point, when one of those things fails, it's highly unlikely that something else is going to fail at the same time. And that's how we get to a safer system. It's not by refining one thing, it's by getting a bunch of pretty good things and putting them together. So here's a little video about just showing the particle filter for GPS and odometry. So the green dots is where the GPS is available, but then suddenly the GPS disappears. And the red is sort of where the vehicle thinks it might be. So here it's just relying on odometry data. So you can see it sort of spreads out, and as it sort of makes its turn, its uncertainty starts to grow more and more and more, until now it's about 5 by 5 meters is 2.5 meters, I guess, is the radius. And you can see some of the candidate locations are right, but there's no real way of knowing until you get that GPS signal back and it sort of snaps back into position. This is called a particle filter, where each particle is, it's called a hypothesis as to where the system is, and the system is constantly updating what its hypotheses are based on new information that's come in. But this is the worst case scenario, just using GPS and odometry. Now we add something called ultrawideband beacons. These are our own sort of localization beacons that we use. They're able to tell you the distance you are from the central point. So over here, you'll see these tiny sort of these tiny squares. These squares within this radius are able to tell you how far away you are from this point, but nothing else. The vehicle will know where each of these squares are. So as that goes, you'll see as it enters each radius, what impact it'll end up having on on where it thinks its position is. And remember, once it gets into these radiuses, it's no longer under GPS. Something interesting to note here as well, you can see the type of error changes. Since it's able to know where it is in terms of the distance from the center point, the error starts to sort of be normal to that, because it knows precisely how far away it is from there, but the places it could be, the candidate locations, will spread out and sort of be will follow an arc along that radius, along that circumference. But as it enters each range of the radius, it becomes very, very fine, and you can get some really, really good positioning data. Here it's under quite a few, and this is enough to drive with using this sort of data. And then once it should hit the GPS pretty on target. Yeah, there we go. And then it gets into that as well, and you can see it grows out again once it goes into the GPS area. And should show the path shows it's a pretty stable path. And then finally, just to show what one of these beacons is able to do. So this is one beacon with a much larger radius. This will amplify the error that we saw before, but it's still able to do quite a lot with just this one extra little thing on there. So you can see, it's following the circumference, and I just think that's really cool, seeing the errors change shape depending on what type of sensor or type of measurement you're using. Swings around the center point, and then it'll hit the GPS at the end of that. And this is from engineers. This is why I'm sorry this isn't as dressed up as I usually make things, but I literally got this output from the engineering team, and I think the audience will appreciate things not looking as pretty, but showing some really, really cool concepts. So some interesting things we learned, some of the learnings that we've had over our experience with putting things out there. First is that since this is a new technology, we found that people's outlook, needs, and perceptions change once they get hands-on experience. This new technology is out of sort of people's reference frame. A lot of the time they're not very familiar with autonomous technology or even first last mile solutions, how you get from home to your train station to your final place. We found though that the people's perceptions and understandings change once they've had a ride on the vehicle, once they've experienced it, especially with things like AI and people's experiences with computers. They think that because their computer at home crashes, maybe, and this vehicle is also a computer, maybe this vehicle will also crash and then my life will be in danger. And the sort of AI is Skynet perception, which is incorrect, but it's out there. And since a lot of the communication we have to do relies on soft skills and people's perceptions, we need to be aware of these these misunderstandings that people might have about the technology or the prejudices they might have. And they're totally valid, and we just need to find ways of including them in that conversation as opposed to just throwing statistics at them and telling them it's all going to be good, just trust engineers. Not everyone does. And we still need to get through to those sorts of people. But these people as well would be regulators, people who are making the rules and policies with regards to this technology. Their understandings also change with experience. So it's really important for us to get out there and show the people making the rules what they are. You cannot just sit in a boardroom or a meeting room or a Zoom chat and then figure out how you're going to roll out this technology perfectly right from the get-go. You need hands-on experience. We've also found that a top-down vision is one of the best ways to ensure success. If from the top of the leadership chain, you get a mandate to have autonomous shuttles or pursue a type of technology, then that's going to do a lot more for your chances at success. However, we have had experience, this is because we've had some experience with maybe an engineering team seeing the benefit of this technology, but they don't really have buy-in from the organization. And so we're sort of knocking on doors on the way up with this team in order to help them solve their goals. But all it takes is one person in a team that might be on the same level hierarchically as the team that's trying to bring you in, that ends up making things a lot more difficult. What we found, so what we found in Korea especially is they want 250 autonomous shuttles in Sejong City. That's something that's been mandated from the top. So the regulators at the bottom who are looking at these vehicles are trying to find ways to mitigate safety challenges or find ways in order to make these happen, rather than seeing the vehicles themselves as a problem that they need to use whatever weapons is at their discretion, bureaucratic or otherwise, in order to ensure that they don't end up being in use. So when we're looking for a partner, we're a little bit picky here. We try to find people who have buy-in with an organization and whether they strategically fit in with where we're trying to go. And this concept as well, it's okay to not have all the answers right away. I feel we're starting to get a little bit into the sort of the culture clash of the different disciplines of engineering here. We're entering into the sort of world of civil and traffic engineers where timelines are relatively long and you can take months or years in order to complete a project. Whereas in software and computer systems and embedded systems and AI, it's all about turnover. Week to week, your technology is changing. You want to have that quick iterative design. And you sort of, as you're developing things, you're going to figure out the answers. And so this understanding that it's okay that we don't know things when we start, let's just start and then we'll figure out what things we need to know, what things we don't need to know, and what of those we know about and what of those we don't. So this rolling out of the technology ends up being the learning experience that you have. You just need to make sure that when you do it, you're doing it in a safe way and not being too reckless with it. And finally, we want to find the quickest way to failure. The word failure has a lot of really bad connotations for some people, but within the field of software engineering and R&D especially, failure is a good thing. The closer you can fail to your concept phase, or within your development or research phase, or your development phase, or your proof of concept phase, the earlier that you can fail, the less impact, the less money you're going to end up losing, and the faster you're going to get a learning from that failure, so that you can use it to figure out either whether something is worth doing or pursuing further, or figuring out how not to do something has value in and of itself. And especially when because we're dealing with a lot of government organizations here as well, or publicly traded companies, this failure culture isn't as prevalent in those sort of more, I guess, traditional institutions. So getting them to change that way of thinking is, I think it's something that's going to come over time, but we try to really find people who are okay with failing and see that as a positive thing going forward. And yeah, I guess that wraps up my presentation. I'll open it up for questions. And yeah, thanks so much for having me here.